Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. In today's show, we're going to discuss Islamophobia around the world, and we're going to start off by discussing the United Arab Emirates. And we're going to hone in on two specific cases in that country, and we're going to include racism into the fore as well. Princess Hind Al Qasimi, who is part of the Sharjah royal family, Sharjah being one of the 7 emirates that make up the United Arab Emirates, she, being a royal member, has called out on Twitter an Islamophobic post by an Indian resident by the name of Saurabh Upadhyay, who I believe is an Indian businessman who works in the United Arab Emirates. Now, he spoke in very derogatory terms about the Tablighi Jamaat, and we know that there is controversy within India about them possibly spreading the COVID-19 pandemic within India or having some part in the spread of the coronavirus within that country. Nevertheless, he generalized that to include Muslims, and the princess did not take kindly to that, saying that that was unacceptable, especially within the United Arab Emirates, which now has very strict laws in place about any derogatory terms towards any faith, in fact. The second case is then that of Tariq Al-Mihyas, who is an Emirati poet and social media influencer who recently put up a video in which he used derogatory terms about Asian migrants, migrant workers more specifically, versus those who are Arab workers, saying that essentially the latter is preferable over the former. And he was defending an Arab actress who had also said something along those lines, specifically for her country. Now, it's important to give credit where it is due. Every country certainly does have challenges with racism, etc., but it's interesting to see how the UAE is now going so strongly against it, as well as, of course, against Islamophobia as well. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're now joined by Waheed Abbas, who is a principal correspondent with Khalij Times. He's based in Dubai. He's worked in the UAE as a journalist for the past 20 years, working for organizations such as Zawiya, Emirates News 24/7, Emirates Business, and the Gulf Today. Also joining us from Dubai is Naved Bakali, who is an assistant professor at the School of Education at the American University in Dubai. He's also non-resident research fellow with Trends Research and Advisory. He's author as well of Islamophobia, Understanding Anti-Muslim Racism Through the Lived Experiences of Muslim Youth. Naved and Waheed, thank you both for your time today. Waheed, tell us, how important do you think it was for Sheikha Hind to come out so strongly and so publicly, really, about these sorts of derogatory tweets? I mean, that's sort of unprecedented, isn't it, even in the UAE?
Yes, Waqar, thank you for your time. Yes, indeed, it's unprecedented and very important from the UAE's perspective. It shows that the UAE has a zero tolerance policy, and the authorities have said it time and again that there will be zero tolerance towards such kind of discrimination, whether it's in UAE or abroad. They locally also they don't accept these sort of incidents, whether it is by the residents or by the nationals, expats, anybody, because there are over 200 nationalities currently living in the UAE. So that is why, in order to maintain the peace and stability and calm in the country, it is mandatory to have, very strict policies in place. Therefore, we have seen a couple of these incidents. The latest is the Emirati, journalist who has been, arrested because of these statements and videos shared on social media. So, plus, in addition, there are heavy fines, jails, and deportations for expats who engage in these kind of, racism or such other activities. So, UAE has always set an example in these sort of, policies to maintain peace, I believe.
And Naved, what do you say about that? Because, I was born and partly even grew up in the UAE. And, for me, again, this is quite unprecedented that a royal family member would come out so publicly and get involved in such a discussion. Do you think it goes to show a positive change where now we have the royal family as well taking this very seriously?
Yeah, I think it's important to acknowledge that, the royal members of the royal family kind of took a stance on the issue. And in general, I think that this idea of tolerance as promoted as a state policy has really kind of been pushed a lot over the last few years. So, 2019, for example, was called the Year of Tolerance. So, as was mentioned before, it's kind of like a state narrative that's really pushing this idea of cohesion through this idea of tolerance. So it's a way that is used in the UAE to kind of manage the diversity to some degree. So, and on top of all of that, I think that in general, the religion of Islam specifically is very much kind of respected, by residents of the UAE. So when someone kind of comes out in such a fashion, in kind of a very offensive way, just kind of, saying things that are kind of totally, off point and, don't really have a strong basis, it needs to be kind of called out. So it is definitely a good thing. But again, I think that, it's important to look at when you're looking at Islamophobia or racism in general, you need to kind of understand that it's more than just things like hate speech or even hate crimes. It's also has a systemic component to it, or structural component, which I think the remarks to begin with from this man, they're kind of stemming from a larger problem which ties to this idea of structural Islamophobia existing in India, which has really been heightened just before the pandemic came out.
Indeed. Let's talk about that in India for a moment, can Waheed, because, Sohrab Opiadia, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, came out on Twitter, right, and he spoke about the Tablighi Jamaat issue within that country. And of course, there's been that allegation, as you well know, that they've helped spread coronavirus within that country. And then that's essentially stained Muslims throughout India, unfortunately, at this time. What are your thoughts about that and the increasing Islamophobia within India?
Yeah, certainly it conveys a message to the Indian communities here as well that this is not something that will be liked here and it will be disapproved immediately, even from the highest level of authorities such as the royals. So it's very important and significant for expats as well. So all kind of expats, especially from the Indian community, because this incident took place in India. So that's very important, I believe. Yeah.
And what are your thoughts about just the Islamophobia within India itself, Waheed? How worrying is that?
Yeah, it is certainly quite worrying because there are a couple of my friends who narrated it incident to me personally because they are resident of New Delhi, and they mention it that there are some concerns in the community because they are living very close to the place where the Tablighi Jamaats were, they were performing their duties over there. So, yeah, it's a matter of concern for residents here, the Indian national government.
All right, so Naved, tell me what your thoughts are about Islamophobia within India, because it's not just India, right? I mean, we're seeing this happening in many places around the world where Islamophobia is increasing even at a time of this coronavirus pandemic, where we have all sorts of odd conspiracy theories flying around about how, quote unquote, Islamic extremists may try to use this in some fashion against the general public in any respective country. What are your thoughts about that? Is this sort of normal within this heightened time of stress and worry for people around the world?
Definitely. I think people become a lot more irrational and a lot more emotional in these kind of difficult, stressful times. So you obviously kind of want to find a source to, kind of scapegoat or to blame. I mean, you kind of want to, your life has been altered in a difficult way, and a lot of fear that's kind of, circulating. And so you already have in various places, a lot of anti-Muslim bias already that exists. And so I think it's a bit of a natural reaction to blame these sort of groups that have already been sort of set aside or already kind of outcast within those societies. And so, again, I think this kind of touches on the importance of looking at Islamophobia beyond just the lens of hate speech, but also seeing how structural forms of Islamophobia and racism in general, when you embed discrimination within the law of a country, like what's being done in India, trying to essentially making a number of Muslims stateless in the country. When you try to pass such reforms in a country, it emboldens those people that already have biases against Muslims. And so it kind of inflames those private actors of Islamophobia when you have the government and within the public sphere when it's being promoted by the state. So I think they kind of go hand in hand. And so, yeah, obviously when you have a group that's marginalized in society to begin with, in a stressful time like this, you look for groups to blame and to point the finger at.
All right, so let's also talk about migrant rights and works if we can for a moment, because I think that's an interesting discussion to also be had, where there has been progress in that in the UAE, Waheed, where we've had Tariq Al-Mihas, as I said, that Emirati poet and social media influencer came out, right, and essentially said, and I'm paraphrasing him, of course, that Arab workers are preferred over Asian migrants, and he's been arrested for that. Again, that's fairly unprecedented, and that shows progress, does it not, Waheed, in the ideology and the sort of mindset about which workers are important for a country like the UAE?
Yeah, certainly, Waqar, very important, because majorities there are expats, and Emiratis are in minority. So therefore, the decision that's been taken to deal this Emirati shows that there is zero tolerance irrespective of any nationality or religion. So it's unprecedented, certainly. And in fact, we've seen a similar instance in other Gulf countries as well. I believe there was an incident in Kuwait as well, where or some other regional countries where one celebrity gave a similar statement against expats and all that. So, and she was criticized all over the social media by GCC nationals, whether they were expats, nationals, all kind of people. So it's this place. The UAE and the GCC is quite very strict in terms of racism. There's a zero tolerance policy. So it's very important and is quite interesting as well.
All right. So then, Naved, how explain then when we have certain governments around the world that are going in opposite directions, right? So we have the UAE, for example, going in a direction where at one point in time it may have been almost taboo to talk about racism and migrant rights, and now it's sort of out in the open, and even Emiratis are being held to account for their racism, or other Gulf citizens are being held to account for their respective racism in public or otherwise. And then we have other countries, even in the West now, or in Europe, such as Hungary or others, who are becoming ever more racist, even openly. What do you make about that difference? Because it's quite vast, and that gap seems to be growing wider.
Yeah, I think what's happening here is that people more and more are becoming more aware of the important role that migrant workers play in the society here. Essentially, if you did not have these South Asian workers that were continuing to work during this time where everything is shut down, the society wouldn't be able to function at all. And so, despite the fact that a lot of these workers are not really kind of treated with tremendous amounts of respect, we're beginning to see, by force, essentially, what important role that they play to help the society function and continue on. And so it's truly my hope that, beyond, whenever we are able to overcome this pandemic, we grow in maturity and we realize that, the important role that people that are often marginalized in society, how they kind of play an important role to help the society function, and they do play an important part, and they should be respected and given equal rights and treatment. In terms of other places, again, I think this touches on this idea that, when you have marginalized members in society, when there's lots of fear and stress that's happening, you obviously want to find a scapegoat, and you want to find people that you can point the finger at. And so it's not surprising that in other places, there's more heightened senses of Islamophobia that are happening. Again, because, you want to obviously find, whenever there's economic problems, whenever there's social problems, whenever there's, now we're facing health problems globally, you want to find someone to blame in your society. Because it's a difficult reality to face. And so I think that's what's happening in other places.
Let's talk about then the rest of the world, because we seem to have, Naved, at this point in time, other countries. As I said, let me become more specific now. When we talk about the U.S., for example, we have a president right now who has spoken in very derogatory terms about, even migrants within his own country. And then we have now Middle Eastern countries, like I said, moving in the complete opposite direction, where they are enshrining into their laws, really, things that, we would not have expected just a number of years ago, possibly, especially for those of us who have lived there. What does that say then about what the future possibly holds? Are we now seeing more rights coming out from this region versus that other region, where it seems to be moving, as I said earlier as well to you, in opposite directions completely?
These are all indications of positive indications where you do have members of society calling out racism. But I think ultimately what's really important is to acknowledge that, a number of states ingrain racism and bias within the law. And until we're able to kind of call out those countries that are passing legislations which are, emboldening, Islamophobia, racism in general within, private actors, nothing can really change dramatically ultimately. So if you look, for example, what's happened in Myanmar, right? So Myanmar essentially had a genocide in August 2017, right? The Rohingya were a marginalized group in society that faced, you could say, structural Islamophobia, structural racism for generations. And so that all culminated in a genocide, which resulted in the deaths of tens of thousands of people. Now, throughout that process, it was rare that a government would call out Myanmar. And even after the genocide, I mean, countries have condemned what's happened to the Rohingya, but ultimately only one country, the Gambia, has really kind of, taken serious action and taken Myanmar to the International Court of Justice. So, and again, maybe some can argue that maybe the OIC had a hand in that, or maybe not. But ultimately, Gambia is the one that's going to face the political ramifications of that. And so, but Gambia, I think, they're an example of what countries need to do when you see other states engaging in structural racism in their societies, because ultimately what happens is that when you have a mix of structural racism and private actors engaging in racist attitudes, they embolden one another. And then, I mean, in a worst case scenario, you can have like what's happened in Myanmar. And you can see this, taking place in India as well. In India, they're starting to pass laws that are very obviously targeting Muslims. And this is emboldening the general population, which is engaging in hate crimes and violence and murdering. And, they could really be on the cusp of something very similar to what's happening in Myanmar if nations don't start calling out what's happening at a structural level, not just at a surface level of hate speech and so on.
All right, Waheed, I'll give you the word. Just tell us about what your thoughts are going forward then for a country like the UAE at this time when it comes to racism, Islamophobia, or otherwise. Do you also feel that things have changed and that things will become better going forward as well?
Yes, certainly, because UAE is always setting examples, and they're the first one to lead, and Dubai, is a commercial hub of the region. So they have to maintain, with such they have to maintain peace with such examples, where they they don't allow any kind of racism or to any kind of nationality. So, yes, going forward, I'm sure things will be much better locally as well as regionally. There's no doubt about it. Yeah.
All right, I'll leave it there at that, but we appreciate both Waheed and Naved for their time today and, of course, for their insight. I know these are tough topics to talk about sometimes because, again, it is fairly unprecedented, as I said, as somebody who's lived in the UAE, to have such an open conversation in that country about racism and Islamophobia, and that too coming from a royal family member, this time a royal family member from Sharjah, Princess Hind, who came out very strongly on Twitter and spoke about the fact that hate is not accepted within the UAE and that anybody who does engage in any hateful conversation online or otherwise will be held to account and even asked to leave the country if it comes to that. And she specifically in this case called out an Indian businessman who lives in the UAE, who's now seemingly shut down all of his social media accounts. He had used the excuse of the Tablighi Jamaat and the possible spreading of coronavirus because of an event that was held under their auspices, though that has then been used generalized against Muslims across India and has entered into a lot of Islamophobic rhetoric, unfortunately, which continues pressure, of course, on Indian Muslims at this point in time. And then we have that case, of course, of the Emirati poet as well, and social media influencers also being held to account for a video he had posted online defending an Arab actress for her slander, essentially, against migrant workers in her country. And he essentially supported her, saying that it's okay if Asian migrants are kicked out, but Arab workers will always be preferred over them. Again, going into very racist, derogatory terms and degrading terms about Asian workers, South Asian workers, who have essentially really helped build up many of these countries at this time. So an important progress, certainly on the part of the UAE, at this point in time to hold to account racism and Islamophobia. And we hope, of course, that only gets better because, as I said, every country deals with these sorts of things, but it's important to have these conversations out and open and not to make these subjects taboo because there's no other way to deal with it but to deal with it openly. I'll be back with the next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. We're still discussing Islamophobia, but this time we're going to hone in on the UK. And there's been a leaked Labour Party report, which has in part discussed also some of the concerns about Labour's issues with Islamophobia. Now, of course, we talk a lot about the Conservative Party and Tories' issues with Islamophobia as well, but the Labour Party has its fair share of Islamophobia within its ranks as well. And this report makes for quite disturbing reading in that regard also. The fact that there was seemingly an effort to delay an investigation into Labour's Islamophobia within its ranks. And this comes out quite clearly in this report by senior party members, or some of them former now. And there's also then talk about senior party members or former senior party members who were quite openly Islamophobic themselves, saying that moderate Islam, quote unquote, had to answer some tough questions, et cetera, about terrorism, and it was difficult to disagree with right-wing commentators and the way that they also spoke about Muslims and Islam in derogatory terms. Of course, a lot of this report also talks about Jeremy Corbyn's leadership and the fact that many Labour Party members worked against his leadership. But it's also important to note that this is at a time, and this is in a context where Brexit is occurring in the country. We're now in a post-Brexit phase, essentially, but the Brexit campaign, in many people's eyes, was one that included also Islamophobia as well as other forms of racism and hate. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're now joined by Tony Gosling, who is an investigative journalist. He's usually based in the UK, but he's currently joining us from New Zealand, Coromandel. Tony, thank you for your time today. I know it's evening there, Tony, but just tell us, what are your thoughts about the Labour Party report? I know that, of course, a large portion of the media is talking about how Corbyn was sidelined by his own party, but it's also important, isn't it, to talk about Islamophobia within Labour's ranks, because that doesn't seem to get as much airtime.
But I must pick you up on one thing you were saying there about Brexit. I personally do not believe that Brexit, although probably most of the racists in Britain voted for Brexit, the Brexit vote didn't happen because of them. It happened really mainly because of the unbridled immigration that there's been under the European Union for such a long time, really since the early 1990s. And the way this has eroded people's living standards, and also meant that there's just not enough accommodation in the country for everybody, and house prices have gone through the roof. This has been a kind of running sore in the politics in Britain for the last 30 years. And that is, I think, to be honest with you, the main reason that the people voted for Brexit, not actually for racists. I don't think the British people are a racist nation. Of course, there are some around, but there is a lot made of this. But I mean, one of the things, you're absolutely right, we don't hear much about at all is the Islamophobia in the Labour Party. And it's quite clear from this absolutely explosive leak. And let's remember, this is from around the time just running up to the 2017 general election. And that was when Jeremy Corbyn successfully toppled Theresa May from her majority. So she then had to do dodgy deals with the Northern Ireland politicians in order to stay in power. So he did a very, very good job in actually eroding the Conservative majority in Britain. But you see, this is feasible, of course. Remember, this is this is 3 years ago. There was also a general election in December 2019, and one has to wonder whether some of the same people were still in place and the same tactics still going on within the Labour Party in the most recent general election too.
All right, we're also now joined by Abdul-Rahman Mustafa, who's a faculty member at the University of Edinburgh. He's joining us now from Edinburgh. Hey, Abdul-Rahman, thank you for your time today. What are your thoughts about Islamophobia within Labour's ranks and what's been released in this report? There's a lot of talk, as I said, about Corbyn and how he was sidelined, but it's also important, isn't it, to discuss the fact that Labour had a hard time really coming to terms with Islamophobia within its ranks?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's historically there's a kind of ambiguity where we've seen a lot of the Conservative Party really has tried to exploit the presence of ethnic minority members, particularly from the South Asian subcontinent, Pakistanis and Indians, to kind of legitimize some of the racist immigration policies and so on that it's had, that it wants to bring forward. Policies that would be much harder to sell if there was basically a white face selling those policies, and somehow there's a kind of tokenism involved where ethnic minorities are being used to sell otherwise repulsive and very undigestible policies. The problem in Labour is slightly different, I think, in that there seems to be, as we now know, a kind of split almost between two kind of different factions of the party, one of which is committed to the older vision of a party, is really opposed to any kind of radical agenda, and the kind of trend of the party, the movement wing of the party associated with Jeremy Corbyn, which is more willing to speak out on issues like Palestine, which are of interest to Muslims, more willing to call out human rights abuses by the government of India in Kashmir, for example, and various other issues that are of concern to the Muslim community and the Muslim diaspora in the UK.
Okay, that's a good point, Tony, that there are issues, certainly, as I'm sure you can appreciate, that are close to many Muslims' hearts, and of course, be it Palestine or Kashmir or otherwise. Do you think that the Labour Party will now be moving away from highlighting that, or do you think that this report will possibly even hurt Muslims' relationship with the Labour Party?
No, I don't think it will hurt, because it shows what was going on behind the scenes. And I would put it stronger than our colleague. I think it's pretty clear here that the Labour Party has been infiltrated by people who have got absolutely no interest in the Labour Party winning in the polls. So you've got people working, full-time people being paid from the member subscriptions and from the union subscriptions that are going to the Labour Party for them to win a general election, are actually undermining that. I mean, we've got quotes saying, with a bit of luck, the polls will decline. So the people who are in there working for the Labour Party don't want the Labour Party to win the general election, because they're trying to do everything they can to undermine Jeremy Corbyn. They're not interested that the members voted for him as the leader. They're trying to undermine him. And another one is, the quote is from their emails and their messages is from, Corbyn is unfit for office. We're going to work to make sure that message gets out. Now, so this is also the worrying thing about this, is there were members of Parliament, Labour MPs, who were also coming out with similar sorts of language. I think it's pretty clear here the Labour Party has been infiltrated by a right-wing faction that was actually doing exactly what the Conservative Party wanted. And so we're now in a situation with Keir Starmer, the former Director of Public Prosecutions. Many people suggest that he's one of the anti-Brexit people, and in all sorts of other ways, he's quite near the right wing of the party to now lead it. So this is a serious problem. He's an absolute gift, Starmer, for the Conservatives. So it could even be that we see the Conservatives, Boris Johnson, staying in for another 10 years because the Labour Party can't get its act together under this new leader. So that's effectively, I think, what we've seen is an infiltration. And you have to look at where that might have come from. If you go back to January 2017, and if you were watching the Al Jazeera TV channel from Qatar, from Doha, you'll have seen a program called The Lobby, where it exposed dirty tricks by the Israel lobby to infiltrate the Labour Party. They actually talked there in that program, which was secret filming, of £1 million being available to undermine or to infiltrate, and for people who could get into the Labour Party and turn it against Palestine. So this is the Israeli, basically it was Shai Massot, the political attaché at the Israeli embassy, making claims which were secretly filmed, and also not just Labour, it was the Tories. They were trying to overturn Alan Duncan, who was a Conservative, vaguely pro-Palestinian defence minister. So this, I think, is pretty obvious. We can put two and two together here and see who's behind it. It's the Israel lobby.
So then, Abdul-Rahman, what does this then mean for the future going forward? Because we have a number of issues, right? So we have Muslims who are, of course, concerned about the foreign policies of the country, be it Palestine, Kashmir, or otherwise. And then we also have some very major issues within the country, right? So we have the PREVENT program, for example, and the fact that that has arguably, in many people's eyes, sort of stained Muslims to an extent where they're viewed with some level of suspicion. Do you think that things are about to get worse, or do you think that there'll finally be somebody who will actually look within and reflect, and hopefully policies will be smarter going forward?
I think you're right. There's a mixture of international and domestic issues. So internationally, of course, the diaspora is always going to be concerned about issues like Palestine, Kashmir, largely because many of them are still, we still have first-generation migrants from those countries, right, in the millions spread out across the world, because in the case of Palestine, for example, or Kashmir, they're literally not allowed to go back to where they were born. So there's that issue. But let's just look more recently at what's been happening. The line between domestic and international is really blurred now, right? So when you have something like COVID-19, it's fascinating in some ways to see the response of the British government, which has managed to charter planes to bring back UK citizens from all across the world, and yet has been really dragging its feet when it comes to bringing back British citizens who also happen to be visiting Pakistan during this crisis. Yeah. So the response between the rate at which Pakistani British citizens and others have been brought back from other countries in the world is really, really striking. And there's been a distinct lack of, voices from the Labour Party calling the government out. There have been a few, Emily Thornberry, et cetera, but really the level of, attention that this issue deserved has just not been there. Once again, we're already seeing politicians in the UK starting to talk about how certain practices of the Muslim community make that community more vulnerable to infection and thereby pose a greater risk to the UK. So once again, we're seeing this demonization of a minority, of a religious minority, in the same way that we've already seen in India, where there's already an established trope with the media and the politicians involved in suggesting that Muslims somehow live in unsafe ways and thereby expose themselves and other communities in the country to infection and to physical risk. This is how demonization happens. And unless people stand up and take a very strong line against that, which we haven't seen so far, I don't see any kind of a very positive outlook for the future, really.
Tony, what are your thoughts about the future? Do you think that the likes of the Tory party, the likes of the Labour Party are willing to reflect upon this and improve things going forward? Because at the end of the day, either or has to be leading the country.
Well, look, many people have looked to the Labour Party to, I suppose, temper some of the more extreme measures. My colleague's absolutely right about the Prevent programme being Islamophobic. In fact, in the city where I live in the UK, in Bristol, the leading party, the Liberal Democrats, basically said we refuse to implement this programme until it's completely rewritten. And so they did. They spent a couple of months rewriting the programme before they allowed Prevent to be actually implemented by the police and by the authorities in our city, which I'm very proud to say. I mean, it's a very multicultural city. But look, everyone is looking to Keir Starmer and the Labour Party to take things forward in a positive way. But we've got serious problems with Starmer. He was, between 2008 and 2013, the Director of Public Prosecutions in Britain. In other words, he was in charge of all the Crown Prosecution Service, basically, the criminal charges against every individual. He could have intervened on some, but he had overall responsibility for the most politicised cases. And it's quite clear that Jamil Rahman and Bijan Mohammed and some others as well, who basically had brought to the police's attention the fact that they had been tortured by the security services, the British security services in other countries, and brought those prosecutions in the British courts. Starmer stopped those prosecutions. So he could have exposed the Islamophobia within the British security services like MI5, MI6, but he refused to do so. And that's why many people are pointing the finger to him and saying, well, look, this guy looks more like an establishment stooge than somebody who's actually going to do something about the rampant Islamophobia, which effectively Britain, as part of the war on terror, has been part of with the United States in a similar way, I have to say. And few people talk about this, but it is rather similar to the anti-Semitism we had from the Nazis in the 1930s. We've seen a ramping up of Islamophobia since the 9/11 attacks, which actually has taken a similar sort of, it hasn't gone so far in some ways, but of course the same kind of comparison should be made because we cannot allow history to repeat itself.
Very well. Abdul-Rahman, final word. What are your thoughts about, again, looking to the future going forward? At this point in time, what does accountability then look like, right? Because we've also had the Tory party being hesitant to sort of come out and talk about its Islamophobia within its ranks. But do you think that this sort of leak will push both parties to finally be honest about this, or do you think this will all just be covered up and hushed up?
I think really we if we step back a few months and examine the controversy over the definition of Islamophobia, which there was a cross-party group of MPs which came up with the definition for Islamophobia, treating Islamophobia as a form of racism, which it undoubtedly is. That recommendation was basically rejected by Parliament. So. And it's clear now that that racism, which was overtly present in the Conservative Party, was also present to a very substantial extent in the Labour Party. I think until we come to terms with what Islamophobia is and how implicated many people in power are, and how there's a kind of institutional racism, institutional form of Islamophobia, we're not really going to get a scale of the problem, and we're not really going to be able to address it very well. So to address the problem, we first have to get some sense of what the problem is. Yeah. And while there are people denying that Islamophobia is a form of racism, is a form of prejudice, I really don't think we can address the problem in the way we would want to.
Very well. We'll leave it there at that, but we appreciate Abdul-Rahman and Tony for their time today and, of course, for the insight and context that they've provided. It's important to discuss Islamophobia or any other form of racism and hate, really, out in the open. It's important to have that sort of admitted, right, to have that entire reality put forth in front of the public or even to the party. And in this case, we're talking about the Labour Party in the UK, which, you would have thought would not have had the same issues that the Tory party would have had in the UK, i.e. the Conservative Party of Boris Johnson. But nevertheless, it very clearly has issues with Islamophobia within its ranks and has had that issue for a number of years now, as proven by this leaked report. Will the Labour Party have the political courage, political will even, to address this property, to have accountability on this issue, to have even apologies come out so that the rest of the British people, those who may even want to continue such hatred, they would know then to stop in their tracks and to not continue to breed such hatred against Muslims or any other minority group in that country. That would be an important first step, certainly, to be able to deal with the situation of how Muslims are treated, as well as other minorities are treated within the United Kingdom, especially in the context of Brexit, especially in the context of coronavirus, where, of course, tensions are ever more heightened at this time. I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.